After so many months and years of waiting, the Switch 2 trailer has finally dropped. It is both as expected and yet in other ways completely surprising. In a moment, I'm going to talk 10 things we can take away from the reveal and how it impacts Nintendo going forward. But before we start, we have to reveal the actual trailer itself. It's a CGI only trailer, so no signs of some specifics like the C button, but this is pretty much the system and it does look beautiful. The increased size, the smoother look of the system, the new fans, and the additional USB port, the potential of which I've discussed before, are all very exciting. We can also see the new kickstand, which looks very fine and is of course far more flexible than the classic old Switch kickstand. I'm a big fan of the new Joy-Con with the coloured bed and the gorgeous features. The pastel looks fantastic, and I think the inverted look of the coloured highlights and the black looks great, although I've absolutely no doubt that we will see more, a lot more probably, colours in time, and potentially even before the launch. The debut of a mouse mode would have been a big surprise if Nintendo had managed to avoid leaks, and while this is a shame, this does also give us a low-key glimpse at the Joy-Con strap. I wonder whether this will also have some means of dampening the ugly sound effects when rumble is used on a flat surface. The way the Joy-Con glide about in the trailer with these straps wagging behind feels so much like the tails of mice, and so I clearly think that this was an intentional reference. We also have the confirmation of the name, of course. No surprise, as we knew it was likely to be Switch 2, but still a big move from Nintendo, and a chance to see the look of the new system overall, with a particular glance at the game that we all knew had to be coming, a new Mario Kart. And while not a huge amount about that game is revealed, it is intriguing. We also see the dock where the Switch is not completely enclosed but is visible, confirming a prior rumour before the very interesting decision to go with an ultra vague 2025 release window. They also have a rather wordy screen talking about Switch 2 exclusive games, as well as Nintendo Switch games with full details later. Presumably, titles like Labo and Ring Fit will not be cross-compatible, but the majority may be, although it will be interesting to see if they find a way to exclude other titles, and particularly titles like Breath of the Wild or even Mario Tennis, where they may want to either re-release or release new versions of those games in the early years of the new console. Certainly, this has to bolster the chances of a Switch Sports 2 release to 70% within the first 18 months, since the leg strap presumably isn't designed for the chunkier Joy-Con, and given how low effort the original Switch Sports was, it's ripe for a bigger and more authoritative version on the new system. And finally, we get a direct reveal. The second time in the last year, we've had a good deal of warning of a direct in advance, and of course, the June 2024 Direct was indeed well worth the wait. We also learn about the Switch 2 Experience events, a series of hands-on events around the world. By 2 minutes 21, we are done, making it a real blink and you miss it trailer. But naturally, it's going to go absolutely viral soon and is the starting pistol fired on the Switch 2 release schedule. But this is Nintendo Forecast, and so the time has come to explore all aspects of what this beautiful trailer augurs for Nintendo. So please hit the subscribe button and settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive into, how good is it to be able to say this, the Switch 2 reveal trailer. So I'm going to start at the end. Takeaway 1, the date. I find 2025 to be a very interesting choice of date. No time frame whatsoever, and while I can't believe Nintendo don't have a landing zone secured with their partners, they clearly want maximum flexibility. I certainly think it more or less rules out any release prior to June. While I once thought an April release had a decent shout, especially given the sales benefits to releasing prior to Golden Week, this is clearly ruled out by the April Direct timeframe. While the most optimistic hope will obviously be that this now means a June launch, in fact I think this does open the possibility of a release later in the year such as September. We think we know this machine is deep in production, although more on that momentarily. We know production takes time and they clearly want a deep bench of stock, but we know that they have the warehouse space for holiday season kinds of sales, and there's no reason to think it makes any kind of sense to keep piling on stock until a Christmas release. On the other hand, I don't think they will want Switch One's newer owners to feel stung. Yes, most of them are likely to be fairly relaxed about their video game consoles, given how long they've taken to upgrade, but they won't want even a risk of buyer's remorse, and so 2025 is a much less intimidating release schedule to announce, even if they later reveal that it's releasing as soon as June. I don't think they could turn around next month and say, actually, it's April and the Direct is also the launch window. I now think 90% that mid-May is the absolute earliest date we would see the machine. June remains the summer date I fancy best, given the long track record of June and Nintendo going back to the Nintendo 64, but perhaps July may warrant a little bit more attention in the future too. Still, April to June certainly matches the pacing of the original Switch launch, with a January blowout and a March release being a 2-month window. I must admit, I've been thinking in recent weeks about a Nintendo forecast law of Nintendo, and if there is one, it's this. The thing you're waiting for will probably take the longest you expect at any given time, and then a bit more. This applies to the wait for Breath of the Wild 2, as it was referred to for a long time. Hardly anybody ever predicted 2023, and while I did have a hunch that 2023 would be likely, even I never imagined that it would drop out of the 2022 to 23 financial year. And the same with the Switch. Go back to previous years. Some people thought it might have an 8-year life cycle, but very few thought it would even make that. Over 8 years? It seemed inconceivable, and yet here we are. Now, I think we are very late on in the game, and for the reasons I've enumerated before, I think a September launch is unlikely, but I don't think it's now by any means out of the question. The assumption has been that this console has been in mass production, but it's clear that they want prototype models at their various locations to show it off, and so perhaps this, and not mass production consoles, are what we have been seeing through these leaks. What if Nintendo want a longer period for people to build familiarity with the new system by showcasing it ahead of launch? What if these C button features so secretive they clearly decided to use a CGI version of the machine rather than the actual thing to prevent it from leaking, for all the good that did, need more extensive testing? What if they want to avoid another Joy-Con drift situation where a key flaw snuck up on them unawares by really seeing how people use these things? Of course, drift wouldn't have been identified in advance anyway because it takes time to develop, but a decent period of people trying the machine and the games does make some sense for Nintendo. In this case, they would need to have a few massive showcase games for February, but then double down on Switch 1 forward-compatible games for the months in between. And what do you know? They have forward-compatible titles that would surely look absolutely brilliant on the Switch too, like Metroid Prime 4 Beyond and Pokemon Legends ZA. And if you think Nintendo wouldn't do this, recall the launch of the Switch Lite. They started stocking up the system with games that were more closely associated with handheld gaming a few months before launch, with Super Mario Maker 2, a title that is far easier, played handheld with touchscreen controls, and Fire Emblem Three Houses. It's not like there were lots of such titles before the September 2019 release of the Switch Lite, but they certainly laid the foundations enough that the new machine launched with a good number of games that particularly suited it. With the April Direct confirmed as a Switch 2 blowout, this timing would certainly give them an opportunity to do a February Direct or even a Mini, focusing on Switch 1 titles in the interim, and then launch a 5-month hype window on the big new Switch 2 games they want to reveal starting in April. Look, I still think either June or September are the likeliest release dates, but I think at this point it has to be a 50% chance that we won't see the Switch 2 in stores before the end of the first fiscal quarter, i.e. July or beyond. It also occurs to me that they could decide to drop the price at the same time as the reveal date, and so they would trade off the inevitable dismay at the system's price, even if it's $399, which I'm not optimistic for at all, people will still cry foul, against excitement that it's literally about to drop from the sky. Anyway, let's look at some of the other takeaways from this presentation, and takeaway number 2 is the name. Is the system's new number-enriched moniker a mark of confidence from Nintendo or a sign that the spark of innovation has been snuffed out? Firstly, let's consider previous naming conventions from the company. We have the Famicom and then the Super Famicom, the Game Boy and then the Game Boy Advance. Both of these are simple adjectives appended to the core system names, which convey that it's the base system but better. And this makes perfect sense when you consider the kind of propositions those systems were. They explicitly wanted to leverage the success of the prior system in order to launch the new one. Then we have systems which needed to do something different and establish their own identity. The Switch, the DS, and the Famicom or Nintendo Entertainment System were all named around the core value proposition in the most efficient way that Nintendo could manage. Especially though in an era of hashtags and websites, brevity is better. And there are systems then which struggled between the two stools. The Ultra Famicom or Ultra 64 ended up being called just the Nintendo 64, as they simplified the name down to focus purely on the biggest competitive advantage they saw the N64 having over its competition, whereas the Game & Watch gave us the GameCube and the Game Boy, tapping into the success of the Game brand for Nintendo. And of course, the Wii embraced a completely different philosophy where, consistent with Satoru Iwata's Blue Ocean philosophy, they chose a name that did not have a previous identification with video game consoles, but nevertheless conveyed the kind of fun and joy they expected people would have with the system. This was a high-risk strategy that pretty much paid off because the Wii was a truly cutting-edge system and they were able to capture market attention with that innovation and associate it with a new word, Wii. That they also managed to do this despite the Wii name having a rather unfortunate urine-themed connotations at first, particularly in Britain, was impressive. However, the thing with doing high-risk names is that you can lose as well as win, and the Wii U proved one inscrutable name too far. Since then, Nintendo has stuck with exceptionally cautious naming approaches. Gone are trendy suffixes like the I on DSi. The 3DS was already a logical name as the 3D concept merged beautifully with the DS, and then the 2DS, 3DS XL, and new 3DS XL each utilized a single extra descriptor that was as direct as humanly possible to convey the value added. Switch needed an original name, and although system producer Yoshiaki Koizumi waded through over 1,000 suggestions, they picked a name which best conveyed the core concept of the system in an efficient way, and then future revisions simply gave us the most direct explanation of the system's differentiating features, light and OLED model. Now, as they try to graduate people to the next machine, the Switch 2 name is obviously what they feel is the simplest, cleanest way to explicate their key value proposition. Super Switch and Advanced Switch risk feeling like iterative revisions of the console, things that didn't really exist in the same way in the 1990s and the 2000s, but which are now much more commonly accepted features of console generations. Plus, remember the social media effect. Switch 2 is just a better hashtag, short, to the point, and it is already used by many people. Nobody is in the least bit confused when you say Switch 2. Does that mean that 3 decades from now we will be seeing and eagerly anticipating the Switch 5? Not necessarily. At this point in Nintendo's life, they want to double down on surely their most profitable system and take the opportunity where they can still remain relatively unassailed in the hybrid market to secure a second generation of success. But that doesn't mean that this degree of caution will suit every season to come. Indeed, if we look back, the DS name lasted only 2 generations, so too the Famicom, despite the flirtation with the name Ultra Famicom for what became the N64. The Game moniker was a little bit more long-lasting, with the Game & Watch, various iterations of Game Boy, and the GameCube all bearing the name. 26 years from the first Game & Watch until the Wii superseded the GameCube. If the Switch name does similarly well, it will be another 2 decades before we need to wave goodbye to the Switch, but I think it is unlikely it will be that long. just because the Switch name is oddly specific, and it is probable that Nintendo will have some other feature that they may want to highlight in due course. Takeaway 3. The logo. More of a surprise than the name, perhaps, is the apparent decision to hew so closely to the original Switch logo, and not for the reason you might expect. Obviously, consistent branding makes perfect sense, and the Switch logo is iconic, but while the original logo benefited from tremendous symmetry, the new logo is now asymmetrical. I do wonder how they'll do the Switch Click introduction to videos without this. After all, the Switch Click is such an iconic thing now, and while at first I can see them having the click come down and then space being made for the 2 to appear, eventually I think they're going to need to find a way to communicate Switch 2 only titles, and they may want to have a more symmetrical logo. On the other hand, they could continue to keep the Switch Click logo without the 2 addition, just as a general brand for their handheld devices, in the same way that PlayStation is the overall brand for the Sony systems. Then they can find other ways of highlighting the games which are Switch 2 exclusive. However, unless they are incredibly careful to be clear which systems they are trailing games for, there is a severe risk of being accused of misleading their customers. Another option is modelled in the trailer, which is just to start product teasers with Nintendo. There's certainly some sense to this. In 2017, Nintendo needed to really establish the brand of the Switch, and so the iconic logo at the start of every trailer really helped push the brand. But the brand is now established, and perhaps they think it's time to reinforce the more valuable corporate brand of Nintendo itself. In this case, in Nintendo Direct, we might get a trailer intro that quickly shows which systems are supported. Imagine a double click for Switch 2 as 2 pairs of Joy-Con click down at once, one click, one snap. But when those trailers are parceled out for social media, I think it is at least 50% likely that they will start their new trailers with simply Nintendo. After all, the Switch is huge, but Nintendo can't thrive indefinitely being reliant on just one console. As we've seen time and time again, the market is too fickle. The time has come to diversify, and the film, theme park, merchandising, museums, and odd hardware innovations like Alamo may well only be the start of that process. Takeaway 4. The sound. Continuing on this theme, the other part of the name and logo that is often overlooked is the sound design around the iconic Switch Click. The original snap sound was modelled on the satisfying snap made by the magnets in their original demo models for the Nintendo Switch, but at that point they felt that the magnets were not sufficiently strong to hold the Joy-Con in place. Nintendo Switch general producer Yoshiaki Koizumi asked the design team, therefore, to replicate the magnetic click for the rails mechanism that the Switch ended up with. So in this case, keeping the broad outline of the click, albeit with more of a snap sound, makes perfect sense, but the sound does sound subtly different. This makes sense as a way to differentiate the systems audibly in trailers, and I can imagine a Switch Click followed by a Switch 2 Snap being the quick way to identify that this game is for both consoles. I wouldn't be surprised if they employed some additional sound design to try to make sure that they approximated the original Switch Click as closely as possible, though. This takes us into the wild and wonderful world of psychoacoustics. Just like car door sounds don't generally need to sound so solid, but the doors have been precision engineered to produce that sound so that people feel confident in the vehicle, Nintendo will want their sound design that their system has to match their intent. The click was attention-grabbing, but it's also quite a clever way to turn a bug, the potential noise around the assembly of the system, which could alarm people at first, into a feature. Nintendo is all about interactivity after all. I'm sure they will have sweated this feature considerably. The difference with the new system is hard to fully discern though, as we only have the CGI demo, but it sounds slightly different, and although of course some of the sound will be the natural upshot of the hardware requirements, you can bet that they sweated that precise sound within an inch of its life, and I think what they're probably trying to convey with the slightly deeper sound is durability. It's subtle, but these kinds of sound cues often are, and I think there's a 50% chance we will hear in the next 2 years, and probably sooner, more about how they arrived at this specific sound. Which leads us on to takeaway 5. The era of personalities is coming to an end. So, this is a general comment on the format of the trailer, and that's how impersonal it seems. We've been so used to seeing Satoru Iwata, Shigeru Miyamoto, Yoshihiko Koizumi, Reggie Fils-Aimé, and Shinya Takahashi populating presentations such as these over the years. In fact, these icons of the video game scene are in some cases nearly household names themselves, at least among the vaguely Nintendo literate. But this trailer deliberately excluded any human being whatsoever. They did not want a focus on the personalities, on the narrative behind the creation. They just wanted a raw focus on the machine itself. This is not unprecedented. We have seen 3DS trailers which show the advantages of the system in similar ways, and in many respects the 3DS and the Switch 2 are very similar. Numerically enhanced new versions of machines with some innovative elements. In the case of 3DS, very innovative elements, but still broadly sticking to the same form factor and style. The decision to exclude even a narrator means that this presentation cuts completely past any cultural boundaries, or at least until the languages appear on screen. In some respects, it seems quite cold, but I think it reflects that long held Nintendo tradition that the products themselves should do the talking. It is notable that since 2017, we haven't really seen any new people pushed into the spotlight in directs in major ways. Sure, we got a glimpse of Doug Bowser, and in the deep dive developer interviews, we are still afforded regular glimpses behind the curtain, but I think that era was probably specific to Satoru Iwata, Reggie Fils-Aimé, and Shigeru Miyamoto. I actually think there's at least now a 50% chance that the next Nintendo Direct does not include any presenters between segments if they can pilot some new way of doing the presentations, though I would say there is a 70% likelihood that we will see at least some interviews with the key people, especially around the release of the machine. All that said, I think the clear reason for going CGI is that they don't want to reveal the actual machine to keep certain things secret, including it seems the much leaked C button. The fact that Nintendo isn't above holding some things back at this stage with regard to even the look of the console does make me wonder if there are any other tricks they could be hiding up their sleeve with respect to their technology. I certainly hope so. Takeaway 6. The reveal. I know the internet has had a minor meltdown over the recent days over the apparent lack of any forewarning for this trailer, but I think looking at the trailer, this makes perfect strategic sense. Don't get me wrong, as a content creator focused on Nintendo, I would love more notice, but I think Nintendo knows that if they actually coveted expectations with this thing, the response would be more lackluster because it is incredibly withholding. The reveal was 3 minutes or less, on the shorter side even of prior trailers, and there was only one game featured, and then very briefly. Of course, as a shadow-dropped announcement, this was very effective. It will instantly pick up steam, and a segment this short has the possibility that it will be picked up by media outlets for a smaller segment showing a lot of the content in its entirety. But while Nintendo are in the expectations management business, that only works for so long. Avoiding expectations for the announcement, which is a low-key launch, well, that kind of makes sense. But they now do need to get hyping. It simply won't work to come along in April and not have a very strong array of games to showcase. I don't think we'll see everything that's coming, of course, but between now and the end of the April presentation, a minimum of 3 new first-party titles has to be 90% locked on, and 50% likely I feel we will see 5 or more. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean they will all be Switch 2 exclusive titles. As I've alluded to, there is the potential for a crossover window of titles during the middle of this year, and in this case they could fill their boots with a relatively dense mid-year. Perhaps 3 games announced for the spring and just 1 or 2 Switch 2 games for later in the year. How would they manage such a staggered reveal? Why, by dropping a trailer after trailer for third-party ports, which would do huge amounts to hype up the system in advance, independent of Nintendo's first-party efforts. Moreover, they clearly want to move straight to hands-on events for the system, so it would give a chance for players to try known games on the hardware. Imagine Call of Duty with Switch 2 mouse controls and people playing Elden Ring all summer at events. It's a great way to draw the contrast between Switch 2 and the legacy consoles, and you have to admit that the third parties will be loving it too. Sure, Nintendo made them sweat it out, but if their games get to be front and center while Nintendo keep to a steadier and more enigmatic rollout schedule, it could be a great way to reward those developers who put a lot of effort into their Switch 2 game versions. Takeaway 7. Super Mario Bros. Wonder is very interesting. The showcase of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, it seems to me, is no coincidence. Super Mario Bros. Wonder was always an interesting title. Releasing at the tail end of the Switch's life, it was nevertheless an absolutely huge deal for the company, being their first original 2D Mario, apart from spin-offs like Maker and Run, in 11 years. Usually a game like this would debut far earlier in a console's run, if not at launch, and while they've done a good job pushing it on the Switch in recent years, they were always going to want to give it a second win somehow on the new system. Now, showcasing Super Mario Bros. Wonder as the example of backward compatibility could mean a few things. Firstly, it could suggest that the game is simply the one they think is the most commercial to use for this purpose. This is a general audience direct, and it's telling that they use the most commercial general audience titles in their arsenal, 2D Mario and Mario Kart. However, Super Mario Bros. Wonder has so far followed the trend of late-era Switch games by not receiving any DLC, and I have to wonder whether they will decide to emphasize the cross-gen nature of the title by giving it a DLC pack that doubles as a Switch 2 edition of the same title. This does, after all, seem like an obvious move for such a successful title, and it allows them to gradually transition players over. The only thing mitigating against this is that while Super Mario Bros. Wonder is a great shop window game to model cross-compatibility of the Switch and its successor, and I think it's something they will continue to emphasize the next 2 years as they try to graduate people over to the Switch 2, they will ultimately need a game that is exclusive to Switch 2, or probably, rather, the Switch 2 Lite. I would double down on my previous view that we will see a new 2D Mario game probably around 2027, and I think a 50% chance at this point at least it is the launch game or in the June or October closest to the Switch 2 Lite or its equivalent. Takeaway 8. Mario Kart. I felt strongly that a game would reveal with the system, because how on earth do you launch a video game system without any video games? And as it turns out, it is Mario Kart that gets the nod, because of course it is. It's very hard to tell much about the title from such an ephemeral glance, although it appears to be the Mario Brothers circuit. This more or less closes off any hope, from this trailer at least, that we're going to see Diddy Kong Racing style story modes, and the circuit name even appears to deconfirm that this one at least will have a Mount Wario style linear course instead of a circuit loop. Of course, there's plenty of time for more to be revealed on this front, and I am optimistic that by naming the course after a game, there will be scope for other games to feature. I realise the prospect of a Smash Kart trajectory for Mario Kart concerns people, but I for one would love to see Pikmin, Star Fox, Splatoon, Famicom Detective Club, and Advance Wars used as the basis for Mario Kart tracks. Actually, what I find curious is that this is the second of the Switch-era sequel titles which focus on the desert as a core locale. Splatoon 3 also made a big feature of its desert location. I'm not sure if it's a coincidence or not. I also wonder why the desert particularly screams Mario Brothers. Not very Mushroom Kingdom-y, it seems to me. Unless, of course, these circuits really do undergo changes along the way. Still, it's nice to get a glance of Rosalina at least. I could see us waiting a fair time before more Mario Kart. After all, there's no particular rush to reveal more information. I give it a 70% chance of new footage in the April Direct, which may seem a little low, but I could see them deciding, maybe, to keep their powder dry on Mario Kart for a little longer. They kept Super Mario Odyssey mysterious for a long time too, and if it's a November release, they may not want April to be the time to showcase it fully without eclipsing the other titles that they will need on their slate. That said, I also think there's a 30% chance we will see more by the end of March, as this includes Mario Day, when it would be more sensible to reveal a big blowout, as it would clearly link in to the Mario franchise. Takeaway 9, the features. I think it's striking that I've got down this far on the list and I haven't really talked at all about specifics of the features. And the reason is that because there aren't that many. The mouse revelation was clearly meant to be a big reveal, and it is undeniably cool, but of course it was pre-revealed. I am a little sad that it was ruined, although I guess I didn't help with videos amplifying it. Nevertheless, while the console is clearly an evolution of the overall aesthetic over its predecessor, it is functionally very much the same. I've discussed before the evolution versus revolution challenge for Nintendo, and I think the time will come for a lot more to be said about how to ensure the Switch doesn't become old hat as a concept. But first, I should address Takeaway 10. Takeaway 10, it looks awesome. I know I've spent a lot of time with cool-headed analysis, but my goodness, this is a beautiful device. The pastel echo of the original's neon colours, which is a really lovely idea. The nearly bezel-free screen, which looks great. The magnetic controls seem like a great innovation, and the kickstand looks fantastic too. USB is there. No word on what kind of USB this is, of course, and it will be interesting, although I think only around 30% likely that they will use different USBs for the different ports, but we will have to wait and see on that one. From initial impressions, it is just a wonderful piece of design work which improves over the original comprehensively, and I just can't wait to get my hands on one. I am sure I will do deeper dives on many of these topics in the weeks to come, and I have a lot of other big videos to come as well, some of which you can already see on my Patreon, so please do check that out. Also check out these videos on screen as well, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.